Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming. What I want to do in this seminar is to get you to think about some of the questions that arise when we are considering the use of technology in education. I am going to argue that while it, i.e. technology, is seen as a relatively unproblematic enhancement of educational provision, its use actually raises some profound and challenging issues. Obviously, I don't have time in 20 minutes to go through all the ways that technology is or can be used in education. And anyway, lists are boring to read and even more boring to listen to. So, I intend to draw on the way technology is used more generally in society and asks whether the benefits it brings transfer to education, and suggest some ways in which this might be researched. My starting point is that assumptions are being made about what technology can offer education, but that these assumptions are not in fact warranted. I'll explain why as we go through, but I think many of us in education are guilty of seeing really quite wonderful advances in the wider world and thinking, ooh, we'll have some of that. But it may not work like that. I'm certainly no Luddite. I think technology does have a lot to offer. But I do think we need to think very carefully about what we're offering students. I'd like to start by considering the self-driving car. Now, many pundits are arguing that this is likely to bring about a revolution comparable to that brought about by the invention of the steam locomotive and the development of the railways in the 19th century. And there's no doubt that that was probably the biggest social change wrought by technology in history. I mean, there is a lot of hype about the internet, but I don't think the effect is anywhere near as profound. Not yet, anyway. What, then, are the advantages of the self-driving car? Well, most obviously, you don't need to learn to drive before you can use one. And there's a lesson for educationalists right there, isn't there? What is the point of teaching people to do something if there's no longer any need to do it? But of course, it's not just a matter of driving from A to B. Some people, for example, have speculated that once cars can drive themselves, you won't need to own a car. You could call one up via an app and only pay for it as you use it. So presumably it would be much cheaper. But what we have here is actually a different set of skills. You still have to know how to use the app. You'd have to know where you want to go. You'd have to plan your times, because presumably the car would still have to get to you. Yes, they're probably also safer. Probably. Yes, there certainly has been one well-publicised fatality involving self-driving cars, but there have been many thousands of fatalities and injuries in conventional cars driven by humans since that incident. But equally, I suppose they are vulnerable to hackers and terrorists. If cars can be called up on demand, it wouldn't really be that hard to plant bombs in them and hide them so they're hard to detect. So again, there's a new set of skills to be learned. Not skills on how to plant bombs, but you know what I mean. Skills about being careful, about thinking what you can get out of this new technology. The point really is that actually for every positive around technology, there's a negative too. You see this, for example, elsewhere in the controversies around social media, like Facebook and Twitter. The media are full of stories about, Facebook paedophiles and Twitter rapists and God knows what else. But in fact, in reality, these are quite rare. For most people, using social media is fairly harmless. But, there are some real nasties lurking in there. So let's get back to education. And the first question, what is the point of online learning? Well, of course, there's some debate about what constitutes online learning. We could cover simulations, online quizzes, virtual worlds, and many other things. But given the time constraints that we face, I'm just going to focus on the online lesson, by which I mean the delivery of a chunk of content either through audio, video, or through text. There's some similarity there with the self-driving car, which is one of my reasons for using that. On the face of it, in your self-driving car, you go on a journey from A to B, whether you are driven by yourself or by a machine is irrelevant. The point is you want to get from A to B. Similarly, if you're standing in a classroom or sitting in a classroom, you're using audio and video. You can see me, you can hear me. Video is Latin for I see, audio, Latin for I hear. So why should online be different? But of course it is different. Is it the same as face-to-face learning? If it is, then presumably we can see some advantages. Clearly, there's no need for a teacher. At least, there's no need for a teacher to be present at every lesson. Why am I here? What am I doing here? Okay, you could argue that I've suffered from my learning and now it's your turn. But seriously, what is the advantage of a physical person in the same room? I intend to go into that a bit more detail, but for now, I'd like to pause for a second for you to think about how you would answer that question. If you listen to this on the recording, then by all means pause the tape and just make a note of how you would answer that question. Okay. Well, obviously, I think the first thing you need to think about with online learning is to what extent is the experience comparable? Surely, it is reasonable, isn't it, for a student to expect the same online as they would get in a conventional classroom, and vice versa. So let's think about what you do get in a conventional classroom. Well, first you get structure. The teacher decides what he or she would like the students to learn and organises the material in a way that in their professional judgment allows the students to achieve the learning objective most effectively. Secondly, the teacher selects resources that are pitched at an appropriate level for the students. Third, the teacher can test student learning and do something about it if they're not learning. Fourth, there are frequent opportunities to review and to critically analyse a proposition. And fifth, there are opportunities for students to learn from their peers, which in some respects is almost as important as learning from the teacher. I'm sure you can think of others, but they'll do for today. More to the point, I think, is the order in which I presented those. The first is quite easy to do. In fact, the text of this talk will be available on my blog. Presumably you know it is because you're listening to it. And I've tried to do it as an audio and video recording, so you can compare that, especially if you actually went to the session where I delivered it live. The second is also relatively easy to achieve, though the internet allows students to choose a wider range of resources, which may prove problematic if they select inappropriate or inaccurate resources. Yeah, look at the metaphor of the self-driving car. There are many routes between two different places, and there are many ways to learn something. But actually, if you only ever chose one, I think that's that. You may be losing something. Testing learning, though, is a little bit more problematic. Yes, it's true that, for example, multiple choice quizzes are relatively easy to provide. And while there's a lot of scepticism in pedagogical circles about multiple choice, I actually do believe that done properly, with proper judgment of marks and adequately difficult questions, hard to achieve, they can have some value. Actually, it's also, there has been some work on assessing student essays online too. I mean, it hasn't got very far. A technique called latent semantic analysis was believed to hold promise some years ago. I'm not sure what happened to it, but and the idea was that you could get a machine to mark an essay. I don't think it's really worked. But I'm not convinced that this really works. Even with good multiple choice, even if essays could be marked by a machine, I'm not sure that anyone really cares that a machine is impressed by their work. You write to make a point to somebody, to show that you have learnt. And actually, machines don't care. But, teachers, on the whole, do. Okay, we all have bad days, but on the whole, we do care. And the other side of all this is what the teacher might reasonably expect of the students. I suppose this takes us into the last two items on my list. I would argue that review and critical analysis of important points is essential to learning, and it's absolutely central to what most teachers actually do. Again, it's possible online, but it's much more difficult to convey nuances in written text. Listen to my voice. I am raising it, I'm making little non-verbal ticks like, oh yes, fancy that, in my speech, which just isn't there in a piece of writing, and it's not there on a computer. Yes, you can certainly correct errors, but computers are unforgiving and completely unable to distinguish between carelessness and ignorance. For instance, if a student wrote that the Second World War lasted for 6 years between 1839 and 1945, the teacher could see that that was a careless mistake, whereas the computer would just say, well, that's wrong, it was 1939. But I think a human can use context to make judgments, where a computer can't really. But I think my fifth factor is a real challenge presented by online learning. It is extremely difficult, in my experience, to get students to engage in debate online, and even more difficult to keep them on track. Why this is a mystery. I think it's partly to do with the asynchronous nature of it. If you say, well, you don't have to do it now, you can leave it a week, we all have that kind of attitude, oh, well, all right, I will leave it a week then. We all kind of work to deadlines. But this is one of my research strategies. One way I've thought of looking into this is to deliver an online course and be really clear about expectations. You must contribute by a certain date. If you don't, then you're going to lose marks. So it should be possible to measure the extent of student contributions and then follow that up with interviews about their experience. It's just one possible strategy. There are some ethical difficulties with it, which I'm sure you can all see. But, it's one way we might research into whether this kind of thing can really be done. I suppose this brings us all to the key phrase in all of this, which is, what is reasonable? You'll all be familiar with the debates about how automation has expanded the boundaries of work. The French have just passed a law establishing the right not to answer work emails outside working hours, for example. And it's true that different people have different expectations. But there are people who expect replies within a couple of hours. But that's not always possible. Not everyone enjoys or is able to sit in front of a computer at 3 o'clock in the morning. And actually, I think it's worth mentioning here that there is considerable evidence that sleep deprivation plays a part in the development of mental illnesses. See Milievich and Lukowski of 2016, for example. Interesting article. Not on this topic, but still quite interesting. So I think we have to set very clear boundaries. A teacher teaching online should respond to students within an agreed time frame. And certainly students should expect that resources should be made available in good time and that they should work properly, if they're audio, video or software based. There may be issues around poor broadband connections here, and the teacher should also ensure that all students can access each resource at the start of the course. I'll rephrase that. There may be issues around poor broadband connections here, and the teacher, at the start of the course, should ensure that all students can access each resource. You see what I mean about being present and actually listening to a recording. I could just have read that out, but anyway, I had to correct myself. It may be necessary to make them available on alternative media, for example. If somebody has got a poor broadband connection and you want to use a video clip, maybe you have to send them a CD-ROM. They still have to have a CD drive. So there are expectations. One, there's quite a lot of additional work which has nothing to do with teaching for the teacher, and there are investments that the student has to make. That's always been true, of course. People have always had to buy books and pens and paper, but what is reasonable? Finally, there has to be an opportunity to discuss and comment on all the resources and discussions which the teacher should participate in, and I think if necessary has to initiate. So again, additional workload for the teacher. So, where is all this leading? Well, I hope not to this image on the slide, but I do think the kind of logic behind the self-driving car is informing some of the arguments around the use of technology in education. Actually, this image is of a kind of brainwave machine. It's nothing to do with education, but you can kind of see, if I could just plug myself in, wouldn't it be great? I won't have to make any effort to learn. If we can have cars that can drive themselves, why not have minds that can be filled automatically? And yes, behaviourist theory, particularly the stimulus-response part of behaviourist theory, has shown us that, yes, very crudely, it is to some extent possible to program minds. If a car can be programmed to stay on a complex network of roads, surely similar mapping can be built into the neural pathways of the brain. Well, actually, probably not. In the first place, the brain is infinitely more complex than the road network of the entire world, but as we move to a more epistemological slant, there is a very limited notion in learning of a correct destination, let alone which side of the road we should drive on. Now, learning isn't about you will be able to do X, Y and Z. To some extent it is, but actually there's all sorts of other things. Where do new ideas come from? Where does new thinking come from? Yes, of course, there are correct solutions to physical and mathematical problems, but social problems are not quite so amenable to an agreed solution, which is why we have all the various political debates that we have. There are people, yes, of course, there are people who think they know all the answers, and they would have us follow them, but I think we can all agree that they're the sort of people who should, in general, be given a very wide berth. The point of all this is that knowledge requires effort to acquire. And I think there is a bit of a myth, which in truth we in education have not done a great deal to undermine, that success is largely a product of ability, and that ability is some sort of innate quality. As Carol Dweck has shown, a much more effective approach is to emphasise the effort you put in, and to take a positive approach to failure. There's actually an Italian proverb that you learn by failing. I'm not going to quote the original Italian, but there's some truth in that. But to go back to Dweck, she distinguishes between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. Those with a fixed mindset tend to see failure as a result of their own lack of talent or ability, while those with a growth mindset tend to see setbacks as challenges and opportunities to learn. I suppose a simpler way of expressing it is that putting in more effort inevitably leads to an improvement in ability. So I suppose it's not entirely mythical to talk about ability. But it's effort that's the key. And I would argue that actually you can't have learning without effort. So the kind of people who are telling you that technology will remove effort from learning are actually doing you a disservice. And in fact, what I'd like to do is have a little brief discussion, again, which we can only do in the classroom. Yes, there are comments on the blog, and you're perfectly entitled to make comments on the blog. But I would like to have a brief discussion about where do you think this is a little bit scary. What do you think? Again, if you want to comment on the blog, please pause and make those comments. Well, I think it's because of the reasons I've given on this slide. I've chosen to illustrate this point with a picture of one bay of shelves in one library in one city. Yes, it's Lincoln, for those of you who are familiar with where I'm giving the talk. Yet reading just one of those books will change you in a profound way. Just one. Knowledge isn't a commodity that can be quantified. And the problem with technology is it works best with quantifiable commodities. My worry, and what I would really like to research, is a message that a focus on technology is sending out about the nature of knowledge. There are no fixed boundaries where you can say that this is knowledge and that isn't. Everything is. Yes, certainly, some knowledge may well be seen as more worthwhile than others, but that's largely an axiological position. True, again, some statements might be factually inaccurate, but they're relatively easy to identify. Yes, there are debates about how we might interpret certain facts, but they are influenced by other facts and by values. This is not a simple transactional interchange. Point is that knowledge changes all the time. That's what we do as researchers. We're always looking for better ways of doing things, trying to understand why things are done in the way that they are. So it's important that we don't just accept the promises of technology, that we remember that those who are advocating technology are usually trying to sell us something. I'm not arguing that that in itself is a bad thing. We live in a capitalist system, and whatever you might think about it, it survives through the exchange of commodities. Our responsibility is to think carefully about what we're being offered and effectively decide whether it offers us and our students enough value to make that investment. Always remembering that we and they, that is our students, have to live with our decision. The people selling the technology don't have to live with that decision. Thank you.